They said she was bought fair and square, but something in her eyes said she never agreed. The stagecoach wheels groaned to a stop in a cloud of pale dust, the kind that hung in the air like it had nowhere better to be, and the town of Dry Hollow gathered the way it always did when something new arrived, quiet, watchful, already judging. Men leaned against hitching posts, hats low, boots planted. Women stood back in doorways, hands folded, saying nothing. When the door creaked open, she stepped down slowly, one hand gripping the frame like the ground might give out beneath her. Her dress was travel-worn, the fabric wrinkled and stained by miles of road and sleepless nights, and there were marks on her skin that spoke of hardship without needing a single word. But she didn't look at anyone. Not the driver. Not the men waiting. Not the man who stepped forward with a paper in hand and a smile that never reached his eyes. Victor Hale. He tapped the folded contract against his palm like it weighed more than it should. "Took you long enough," he muttered, reaching for her arm as if it were already his to claim. She didn't resist, didn't flinch, just followed the pull like someone who had already run out of strength miles ago. And that's when Silas Boone noticed the necklace. It was small, easy to miss. A thin leather cord with a single carved stone resting just above her collarbone. Apache work. He knew it the moment he saw it. Not something a mail-order bride would wear by accident. Not something you forgot to take off. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of dry wood and distant rain that never came, and Silas felt something settle heavy in his chest. He had seen that kind of peace before. Years ago, in a place far from towns like this. Victor gave her arm a short tug. "Walk," he said, like he was tired of waiting, like patience had never been something he practiced. The sheriff stood nearby, leaning against a post, watching the exchange with the kind of indifference that came from seeing too much and doing too little. Papers were papers. A deal was a deal. That was the law here. The girl stumbled once, just a step, but enough for the necklace to catch the light. Silas moved before he realized he had decided to. Boots slow, measured, each step pressing into the dust like it mattered. "She ain't going with you," he said. Not loud. Didn't need to be. The kind of voice that didn't ask to be heard. It simply was. Victor turned, brows lifting like he couldn't quite believe someone had spoken. Then he laughed. "Low. Easy. You planning to pay for her, Boone?" he asked, glancing around like the town might join in. No one did. Silas didn't answer. His eyes were on her now, really looking. And for the first time, she looked back. Just a flicker. Just enough. Her lips parted slightly, dry from the road, and her voice came out thin but steady. "That's not my name." The words barely carried past them, but they landed, harder than anything else that had been said. Silas reached out, slow enough not to startle her, and took her hand. It was colder than he expected. Lighter too, like she hadn't held on to much in a long while. He stepped back, placing himself between her and Victor without another word. The town held its breath, because out here, it wasn't the loudest man who decided what happened next. It was the one who didn't move. Victor Hale did not step back, not at first, but the smile on his face shifted into something thinner, something that no longer reached his eyes as he studied Silas Boone like a man trying to measure distance before making a move, the paper in his hand tapping once more against his palm, as if to remind everyone standing there that ink and signatures carried more weight in Dry Hollow than right or wrong ever did. "You are standing between me and what is mine," Victor said, his voice calm in a way that did not match the tension building in the air, and still Silas did not answer, his hands steady around the girl's as if the world behind him had already been decided, and nothing in front of him could change that. The sheriff shifted his stance, boots scraping softly against the wooden boards, not stepping in, not stepping away, just watching with the quiet discomfort of a man who knew the difference between law and justice, but had chosen his side a long time ago. A breeze rolled through the street carrying dust, and the faint creak of a loose sign somewhere above the saloon, and in that small, ordinary sound something unspoken passed through the crowd, a hesitation, a question, because this was not how things usually went. Men like Victor spoke, and others followed. Deals were honored even when they should not have been, and women like her disappeared into houses without names, without stories, without anyone asking if they had ever agreed to the life waiting behind those doors. But Silas remained where he stood, unmoving, his shadow stretching long across the boards as the sun leaned west. "You got no claim here," Victor continued, louder now, glancing around as if expecting the town to echo him. But the silence that answered felt heavier than any agreement. The girl's fingers tightened slightly in Silas's grip, not pulling away, not holding on, just present. Like she was still deciding if this moment was real or just another turn in a road she did not choose. And then she spoke again. A little stronger this time. "My name is Eliza," she said, the words careful, like something she had not said out loud in a long while. And that changed something. Not in Victor, not in the sheriff, but in the space between everyone else, because names had a way of making things harder to ignore, harder to dismiss as property or paper. Silas nodded once, small, almost invisible, but enough for her to see. Enough to say he had heard her, truly heard her, and when he spoke again his voice carried that same quiet certainty. "Then Eliza is not going anywhere she does not choose." A murmur rippled through the edges of the crowd, not loud, not bold, but there, like the first crack in dry earth before rain. Victor's jaw tightened, the paper in his hand folding slightly under his grip. "Choice does not factor into this," he replied, sharper now, stepping forward just enough to test the line Silas had drawn without ever saying it. But Silas did not move, not an inch, and for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. The two men stood facing each other with nothing but a few feet of wormwood between them and the weight of an entire town pressing in from all sides. The kind of moment where something usually breaks, where someone reaches for something final. But instead there was only stillness, thick and unyielding, until somewhere behind them a door creaked open and a woman stepped onto the porch of the general store. Then another figure shifted near the well, and another by the hitching post. Small movements, barely noticeable, but enough to say the silence was no longer empty. It was watching, waiting, and for the first time since the stagecoach had arrived, Victor Hale realized that whatever he thought he owned had just become something far more difficult to take. The moment did not end with a shout or a gun. It ended with something far stranger. Victor Hale stepping back half a pace. Not enough to surrender, just enough to rethink, his eyes narrowing as he studied the girl now standing behind Silas Boone, like she had crossed an invisible line and could not go back. The paper in his hand no longer looked like power, just ink on thin parchment that did not breathe or speak or choose. And that difference hung in the air heavier than dust. "This town runs on agreements," Victor said after a long second, his voice lower now, more careful. "You start breaking those, you do not just make trouble for me, you make trouble for everyone." He gestured slightly toward the buildings, the people, the quiet lives built on simple rules that no one questioned out loud. But Silas did not look at the town. He did not look at the sheriff. He only looked ahead as if the road had already been decided miles before this moment ever came. "Then maybe it is time. Something changes," he said, and the words did not rise, did not fall. They simply settled, like a stone placed exactly where it belonged. The sheriff exhaled through his nose, pushing off the post at last, his boots hitting the boards with a dull, measured sound as he stepped closer, not fast, not eager, just a man pulled forward by something he could no longer ignore. "Boone," he said, not unkind, but firm. "You know how this works." Silas gave a small nod, like he had heard it all before, like he had lived inside those rules and walked away anyway. "I do," he answered. "But she is not a horse, and she is not a crate of goods." The sheriff's jaw shifted, eyes flicking briefly toward Eliza, really seeing her now for the first time, not just as a figure arriving on a coach, but as a person standing there with a name that had been spoken out loud, a name that could not be folded into a contract and tucked away. The silence stretched again, longer this time, and in that stretch the town seemed to lean, not physically, but in something deeper, a shift so small it might have been missed if not for the way people stopped pretending to be busy, stopped looking away, and simply watched. Eliza's hand trembled once in Silas's grip, then steadied, her shoulders drawing just a fraction higher, like a person remembering how to stand. Victor noticed it too, and that seemed to bother him more than anything else. Not the defiance, not the interruption, but the possibility that what he thought was settled might not be. "You think you are saving her," he said, almost quietly now, "but you are just delaying the same ending." Silas finally turned his head slightly, enough for Victor to see the edge of his expression, calm, certain, unshaken. "No," he replied. I am giving her the chance to choose a different one. The wind picked up again, brushing past coats and skirts, rattling the loose board above the saloon door, and somewhere in the distance a horse shifted, hooves tapping against packed dirt. Small sounds, ordinary sounds, but they filled the space where tension had been, as if the world itself was waiting to see which way this would turn. The sheriff looked between them once more, then down at the paper in Victor's hand, then back at Eliza, and something in his posture changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would be told as a story later, but enough, just enough. Papers do not mean much if they are signed without a willing hand, he said slowly, like he was choosing each word with care. And Victor's eyes sharpened at that. You are stepping outside your place, Victor warned, but the sheriff did not answer right away, his gaze still on Eliza, who met it now without lowering her eyes. And for a moment the entire town held that look with her, as if waiting for her to speak again, to confirm what everyone had begun to feel but not yet say. And just as the silence reached its breaking point, a distant sound carried in from beyond the edge of town, soft at first, almost mistaken for wind, then clearer, steady, rhythmic, the unmistakable approach of horses moving together, not fast, not reckless, but deliberate, and every head turned toward the horizon at the same time. Because whatever was coming was not part of the plan any of them thought they understood. The sound carried across the open land like a quiet drumbeat, steady and unhurried, and it changed the air before anyone could say a word. Dust lifting at the far edge of town where the road curved between low hills, sunlight catching on movement that was too deliberate to be travelers passing through, the kind of movement that made men straighten without knowing why. Victor Hale turned first, his confidence tightening into something sharper as his eyes searched the horizon, counting shapes. Before they were clear, the sheriff followed, one hand resting near his belt out of habit more than intent, and Silas Boone did not turn right away, his gaze still forward as if he already knew what was coming, as if this moment had been waiting just beyond the last one. Eliza felt it before she saw it, the shift in the ground, the silence behind her growing heavier, and her fingers moved instinctively to the necklace at her throat, pressing it lightly against her skin like a memory she had carried farther than anyone here could guess. The riders came into view slowly, not rushing, not scattering, a line of figures moving with a kind of unity that did not need commands, their horses stepping in rhythm, hooves striking dirt in a measured cadence that echoed through the street. And when they reached the edge of town, they did not stop abruptly, they slowed, each movement controlled, each distance chosen, until they formed a quiet presence that stretched across the road like a boundary no one had drawn but everyone understood. No one spoke, not the men by the hitching posts, not the women in the doorways, not even Victor, who now held the folded paper lower at his side, as if it had lost some of its weight. The lead rider stepped forward a few feet ahead of the others, her posture straight, her gaze steady, and though she wore no symbol of rank that the town would recognize, there was no question where the attention settled. Ayanna, her name did not need to be spoken yet. It moved ahead of her in the way the others held their distance, in the way the air itself seemed to make space. Her eyes moved across the scene once, taking in the positions, the tension, the girl standing behind, the man who had not moved, and when her gaze reached Eliza it did not pass. It held, and something changed, subtle, immediate, like a thread pulled tight between 2 points that had not known they were connected until now. Eliza's breath caught just slightly, not fear, not surprise, something deeper, something that had been waiting without knowing for what. The necklace in her hand warmed under her touch, and for a moment the noise of the town fell away entirely, leaving only that line between them. Ayanna inclined her head once, not a bow, not submission, recognition, and the gesture carried more meaning than any words spoken so far. Victor found his voice again, though it came slower this time. This is not your concern, he said, trying to reclaim ground that had already shifted beneath him. But Ayanna did not look at him. Not yet. Her attention remained where it had settled, and that choice spoke louder than any answer. Silas finally turned his head slightly, enough to see the riders clearly now, enough to confirm what he had already felt in the air. His stance did not change, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in the way his shoulders eased, not relief, not surrender, just the understanding that the moment had grown larger than one man and one paper. The sheriff cleared his throat softly, uncertain now in a way he had not been minutes before, because this was no longer about a contract, no longer about town rules that held when everyone agreed to them. This was something older, something that did not need writing to exist. The wind passed through again, stirring coats and hair and the edges of that thin paper in Victor's hand, and for the first time since the stagecoach arrived, the balance of the street shifted completely, not with force, not with threat, but with presence alone. No one reached for a weapon, and that was what made it different, because out here silence could mean many things, but this silence carried weight, the kind that pressed down on a man's choices until he felt them in his bones. Victor Hale shifted his stance again, slower this time, careful, his eyes moving from Ayanna to the line of riders behind her and back again, as if trying to understand something that did not fit into the rules he had always followed. "You ride into my town like you own the ground," he said, but the words lacked the edge they once held, like they had been worn down by the distance they traveled. Ayanna finally turned her gaze toward him, and when she did, it was not with anger, not with challenge, but with a calm that carried something far steadier, something that did not need to rise to meet him. It simply stood where it was. "No one owns the ground," she replied, her voice even, clear, the kind that did not rush or push. It settled, like water finding its level, and that answer seemed to shift the air again, subtle, but real. Victor let out a short breath through his nose, glancing toward the sheriff as if expecting support, but the sheriff did not move, his eyes now on Eliza, watching the way she stood, watching the way her hand still rested near the necklace, as if that small piece carried more truth than the paper in Victor's grip. Silas Boone did not speak, not yet. He stood as he had from the start, steady, unyielding, but now there was something else in his stillness, not just defiance, not just resolve, something like recognition, as if the pieces of a story he had not known he was part of were finally coming together. Eliza took a small step forward then, not away from Silas, not toward Victor, but into the space between, her movement quiet, almost uncertain, yet it carried across the street like a signal no one could ignore. She looked at Ayanna, really looked now, and whatever she saw there seemed to anchor her, to give shape to something she had been holding without words. "I did not know if it was real," she said softly, her voice steadier than before. "I kept it because it was the only thing that felt like it belonged to me." Her fingers brushed the necklace again, and for a moment the town seemed to lean closer without moving. Ayanna listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, but her eyes held a depth that spoke of memory, of time measured in more than days or miles. "You kept it," she said after a pause, not as a question, but as something acknowledged, something understood. And that simple exchange carried further than any argument that had come before it. Victor tightened his grip on the paper again, the edges bending under his fingers as if he could press it back into importance. "This changes nothing," he insisted, though the words came slower now, less certain. "A contract is a contract," but the sentence did not land the same way it had earlier. It did not settle, it hovered, uncertain, as if waiting for something to confirm it, and nothing did. The riders behind Ayanna remained still, not advancing, not retreating, their presence alone enough to redraw the space, not through force, but through something quieter, something older, the kind of presence that reminded a man that not everything could be written down and owned. The sheriff shifted again, his hand dropping fully from his belt now, his posture no longer caught between sides, but leaning, just slightly, towards something he had not chosen before. "Maybe it does change something," he said, almost to himself, but loud enough to be heard. And that was enough, enough to tip the balance a fraction more, enough to make Victor realize that the ground beneath him was no longer as solid as it had been an hour ago. The wind moved through once more, lifting dust, brushing past faces and coats, and in that quiet movement, the town of Dry Hollow stood at a line it had not seen before, a line not drawn by law or money, but by something far harder to ignore, the simple question of what a person was worth when they finally spoke their own name. The wind did not die down. It settled, like it was waiting for someone to finally say what had been left unsaid for too long, and in that quiet stretch between words, Eliza Hart took another step forward, small but certain, her boots pressing into the dust as if claiming a place she had never been allowed to stand before. Her fingers released the necklace now, letting it rest freely against her chest, no longer something she needed to hide or hold on to for strength, because something in the way Ayanna looked at her had already given that back. "I did not come here by choice," Eliza said, her voice steady enough now to carry across the street. Not loud, not pleading, just true. And truth had a way of cutting through noise without needing force. Victor Hale shifted again, impatience creeping back into his posture, but it was thinner now, stretched, like it could tear if pushed too far. "That does not matter," he replied, though even he seemed to hear how hollow that sounded in the open air. "You signed the paper." Eliza shook her head slowly, not in anger, not in defiance, but in something clearer, something rooted. "No," she said. Name was written, but it was not mine, and that landed harder than anything before it, because it was simple, undeniable in a way no contract could argue. The sheriff drew in a slow breath, his shoulders lowering just slightly as if a weight he had carried without question was finally being examined. Silas Boone remained beside Eliza, not in front of her now, not shielding, just present, like a man who understood the difference between standing for someone and standing with them. And that difference changed everything in the space between them. Ayanna watched the exchange without interruption, her gaze steady, measuring not the words but the meaning behind them. And when she spoke again, it was not to challenge, but to confirm. "Where I come from," she said, her voice carrying that same calm authority. "A person is not bound by a mark they did not choose." The words moved through the town like a slow current, not loud, but persistent, touching each person in a way they could not easily ignore. Victor let out a short laugh, though there was little humor in it now. "This is not where you come from," he said, trying once more to pull the moment back into something he understood, something he controlled, but the effort fell short, because the ground beneath him had already shifted. The sheriff stepped forward then, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality that drew every eye, his gaze moving from Victor to Eliza and back again, weighing, deciding. "Then maybe it is time we start asking what should matter," he said, his voice lower than before, but firmer, like a man who had reached the end of something he could no longer pretend not to see. Victor stared at him, disbelief flickering across his face. "You are turning your back on the law," he said, but the sheriff did not flinch. "No," he answered. "I am finally looking at it." And that was the moment the balance broke, not with force, not with raised voices, but with something quieter, something far more lasting. The town did not erupt. It did not cheer. It simply shifted, one person at a time. A woman stepping fully out onto the porch, a man lowering his gaze instead of meeting Victor's. Small changes, but together they formed something undeniable. Victor looked around, searching for support that no longer stood where it had minutes ago. The paper in his hand now just a piece of paper again. Nothing more, nothing less. And for the first time since he had spoken, he had no words ready to follow. The wind moved through once more, lifting dust, carrying the faint scent of distant rain that still had not arrived. And in that quiet, Eliza stood where she had chosen to stand, not owned, not claimed, simply present, and that alone was enough to change everything. Victor Hale did not leave, not right away. And that was the last piece of the old world trying to hold its place. He stood there with the paper still in his hand, though it no longer looked like it belonged to anything solid, his eyes moving across the faces around him, searching, measuring, waiting for someone to step forward and restore what had always been, but no one did. Not the sheriff who now stood with his weight settled evenly on both feet, not the men who had once nodded along to every word Victor spoke, not even the silence. Because the silence had changed, it was no longer empty, it was full of choice. Eliza Hart felt it as clearly as the ground beneath her boots, the difference between being carried somewhere and standing somewhere. And for the first time since she had arrived, she drew a full breath without hesitation, the air dry, warm, real, her shoulders rising and falling with it, as if her body was remembering something it had forgotten along the road. Silas Boone remained beside her, not speaking, not guiding, just present. And that presence did not press, did not demand, it allowed. And that was something Eliza had not known how to expect. Ayanna watched the scene with the same steady calm. But there was a subtle shift now, something softer beneath the strength, as if the outcome she had come to witness was already taking shape without her needing to force it. The riders behind her remained still, their horses quiet, heads low, waiting without impatience. Because waiting was part of knowing when something had reached its turning point. Victor finally lowered the paper. Completely, his hand falling to his side. The edges of the contract no longer straight, bent from being held too tightly. "You are making a mistake," he said. But the words did not carry the same weight. They did not land the way they once would have. They drifted, like dust caught in the wind. The sheriff glanced at him, not unkind, but no longer aligned. "Maybe," he answered, "but it will not be the same mistake we have been making." And that answer settled something final in the space. Between them, Victor looked around once more, slower this time. And what he saw was not opposition, not defiance, but absence, the absence of agreement, the absence of silent support that had once been enough to give him power. And without that, the paper in his hand was nothing more than paper. He let out a breath, long and controlled, then folded the contract once, twice, and slipped it into his coat as if storing away something that no longer applied. He did not argue again, did not step forward. He simply turned, boots striking the boards with a quieter sound than before, and walked back toward the street he had come from, each step carrying less certainty than the last, until the distance between him and the others became something he could not easily cross again. The town watched him go, not with triumph, not with relief, but with a quiet understanding that something had ended without needing to be broken. Eliza remained where she stood, her gaze following him only for a moment before returning to the space in front of her, to the people who had stayed, to the ground that now felt different beneath her feet. The wind moved again, softer now, brushing past her hair, lifting the edge of her dress, and she did not pull back from it. She stood in it, as if letting it pass through her without resistance. Silas shifted his weight slightly, not stepping away, not stepping closer, simply adjusting to a moment that no longer required him to stand in front of her. And that small change said more than anything else he could have done. Ayanna inclined her head once more, this time deeper, not to claim, not to command, but to acknowledge. And then she turned her horse with a gentle movement of the reins, the riders behind her following without a word, their line breaking smoothly as they began to move away from the town, not hurried, not lingering, just leaving as quietly as they had arrived. And as the sound of hooves faded into the distance, Dry Hollow stood in a stillness that felt new, not empty, not uncertain, but open, like a place that had just learned it could choose a different story. The dust settled slowly after the riders disappeared beyond the low hills, and with it came a quiet that did not feel empty, but changed, like the town itself was taking its first breath after holding it too long. No one spoke at first, not because they did not have words, but because none of them fit the moment that had just passed. The creak of a loose shutter somewhere down the street sounded louder than it should have. A horse shifted its weight near the hitching post, leather reins brushing softly, ordinary sounds returning one by one as if testing whether things were truly different now. Eliza Hart stood still in the center of it all, her hand no longer reaching for the necklace, no longer needing to hold on to it like a lifeline. It rested where it belonged, and for the first time it did not feel like something she had to protect, but something that simply was, like her name, like her place on the ground beneath her boots. She turned slightly, her gaze moving across the faces around her, the same people who had watched her arrive in silence. But now their silence was not the same. It was not the kind that looked away, it was the kind that stayed, that acknowledged, even if it did not yet know what to say. The sheriff cleared his throat quietly, stepping back a half pace as if giving the moment back to her, his badge catching a sliver of sunlight, no longer the final word it once had been. "You will not be forced to go anywhere," he said, the sentence simple, but it carried weight now, because it had been chosen, not assumed. Eliza nodded once, a small movement, but steady, her voice coming after a pause. "Thank you," she said, not just to him, not just to Silas, but to the space itself, to the moment that had allowed her to speak and be heard. Silas. Boone shifted slightly beside her, his boots pressing into the dust as he turned just enough to face her fully now, not as a shield, not as a barrier, but as a man meeting another where they stood. "You have a place if you need one," he said, his tone the same as before, calm, unforced, offering without expecting, and that mattered, the way he said it, because there was no claim in it, no expectation tied to the words, just a door left open. Eliza studied him for a second longer than most would, as if weighing not just the offer, but the man behind it. And something in his stillness gave her an answer she did not need to speak out loud. She nodded again, a little more certain this time. "I will walk there myself," she said. And that was the difference, not the destination, but the way she chose it. Silas gave a small nod in return, stepping back half a pace to let her move first, and when she did, it was slow, deliberate, each step her own, the boards beneath her feet sounding different now, not hollow, not uncertain, but solid, like they had been there all along waiting for her to claim them. The townspeople watched as she passed, not stepping aside out of obligation, but out of something closer to respect, something new that had not been there before. The woman on the porch lowered her hands from where they had been folded tightly. A man near the well removed his hat. Small gestures, quiet, but they added up. They changed the shape of the moment. Behind her, the sheriff remained where he stood, no longer leaning, no longer distant, just present in a way he had not allowed himself to be before, and Silas followed a few steps behind Eliza, not close enough to guide, not far enough to disappear, just there, steady as the horizon. The wind moved once more through Dry Hollow, softer now, carrying with it the faint promise of rain that might come later, and as Eliza reached the edge of the street and stepped onto the open path beyond, she did not look back right away, because for the first time in a long while, she did not need to. The road stretched out ahead of her in a long pale line, cutting through dry grass and low wind-bent brush, and for a while the only sound was the soft rhythm of boots against packed earth, steady, unhurried, like each step was being placed with intention instead of habit. Eliza's heart did not rush, did not look back, because the town behind her no longer held what it once had, and the path ahead did not feel like something she was being led into. It felt like something she was walking toward on her own terms. The sky above had begun to shift in color, late afternoon light softening the hard edges of everything it touched, turning dust into gold and shadows into something deeper. Silas Boone followed at a distance that said more than any words he could have chosen, close enough to be there if needed, far enough to leave the space hers, and that balance remained, quiet, steady, the kind of presence that did not press, did not guide, just accompanied. After a few yards, Eliza slowed, slightly, not stopping, just enough for her breathing to settle into something calmer, something that no longer carried the weight of urgency. Her hand brushed lightly against the necklace again, not gripping it this time, just acknowledging it, as if the small carved stone had shifted from being a reminder of something lost to something that had found its way back. She glanced to the side then, just briefly, the horizon stretching wide and open, and for a moment she allowed herself to take it in, the distance, the quiet, the possibility that came with it. Behind her, Dry Hollow remained still, but not the same kind of still it had been before. A few figures lingered at the edge of the street, watching not out of curiosity, but something closer to reflection, as if they were trying to understand what had just taken place and what it meant for them moving forward. The sheriff stood near the post where he had been earlier, but his stance had changed, no longer leaning, no longer detached, his hands resting loosely at his sides as he watched the road instead of the people, like a man reconsidering the lines he had drawn for himself. Silas adjusted his pace slightly when Eliza slowed, keeping the same respectful distance, his eyes on the path ahead, not on her, not on the town, but on the direction they were moving, because that was where the next choice would be made. After a while, Eliza came to a stop, not abrupt, not uncertain, just a natural pause as the road widened slightly where a narrow trail branched off toward a small rise in the land. She stood there for a second, looking at the split, considering, and then she turned her head just enough to acknowledge Silas without fully facing him. "Which way leads to your place?" she asked, her voice calm, steady, the question simple, but it carried something more beneath it, not dependence, not obligation, but willingness. Silas stepped forward then, closing the distance by a few feet, not rushing, his boots making the same quiet sound against the ground. He gestured toward the path that curved gently to the right. About half a mile that way, he said. Nothing much, just a small house and a stretch of land that keeps me busy. He did not add anything more, did not try to make it sound like more than it was, and that honesty settled easily in the space between them. Eliza nodded once, turning her gaze back to the path he had indicated, and for a moment she stood there, considering not just the direction, but what it meant to take it. Then she took a step forward, choosing it, not because it was offered, but because it felt right. Silas fell into step behind her again, the distance returning to what it had been, steady, unspoken. The wind moved softly across the open land, carrying with it the faint scent of something distant, something that might have been rain or simply the promise of it. And as they walked, the road ahead did not feel empty, it felt open, like something waiting to be written one step at a time. The path curved gently as it climbed a low rise, the ground firmer here, packed by years of quiet use rather than heavy traffic. And with each step the sounds of dry hollow faded until they were nothing more than a memory carried on the wind. Eliza Hart noticed it first in her breathing, how it came easier now, how her shoulders no longer held the same tension they had when she stepped off that stagecoach. The land around her stretched wide, open in a way that felt unfamiliar yet honest. No walls, no eyes watching from doorways, just sky and distance and the faint rustle of grass bending under the breeze. Silas Boone walked behind her as before, his pace steady, unchanging, not closing the distance unless she slowed, not falling back unless she moved ahead, a quiet rhythm that matched the land itself. And after a while he spoke, not to fill silence, but because the moment allowed it. "There is a well about 100 yards past the house," he said, his voice carrying easily across the small space between them. "Water runs clean most days, if the ground stays kind." Eliza listened, nodding slightly, the practical details settling into place like something real she could hold on to, something that belonged to the present rather than the past she had left behind. The trail leveled out as they reached the top of the rise, and from there the land opened even more, revealing a small structure set back from the path, simple, weathered, the kind of place that did not try to impress, just to endure, a house with a low roof, a narrow porch, and a stretch of land that showed signs of care rather than control, a fence line that had been mended more than once, posts leaning slightly but still standing, a few tools resting near the side of the building where they had last been used, not arranged, not displayed, just left where work had paused. Eliza slowed again as they approached, taking in the details, the quiet honesty of it, and something in her expression softened, not relief, not yet, but recognition. Like she had found a place that did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. Silas stepped forward then, just enough to come alongside her for the first time since they had left the town, his gaze moving briefly across the property as if seeing it through her eyes. "It is not much," he said, but there was no apology in his tone, just fact, and that mattered. Eliza shook her head lightly, her eyes still on the house. "It is enough," she replied, and the words carried a weight that went beyond the structure itself. Silas gave a small nod, accepting that without question, without adding to it, because he understood that enough was not measured in size or condition, but in something quieter, something harder to define. They walked the remaining distance in silence, the boards of the porch creaking softly as Eliza stepped onto it first, the sound different from the town's boards, less worn by traffic, more by time. She paused near the doorway, her hand hovering briefly near the frame before resting against it, feeling the solid wood beneath her fingers, grounding herself in something that did not shift, did not pull away. Silas remained a step back, giving her the space to enter first if she chose, and after a moment she did, pushing the door open slowly, the interior dim compared to the bright afternoon light, but clean, ordered in a way that spoke of habit rather than display. A table near the window, a chair set beside it, a small stove against the far wall, everything in its place, not because it had to be, but because it had been put there with intention. Eliza stepped inside, her boots sounding softly against the wooden floor, and for the first time since her journey began, the sound did not echo with uncertainty, it settled, like it belonged. She turned slightly, looking back, toward the doorway where Silas still stood, not entering yet, not assuming. And in that quiet exchange, something unspoken passed between them, not a promise, not an agreement, but a beginning that did not need to be named to be real. The light inside the house shifted slowly as the door remained open. Afternoon sun stretching across the wooden floor in long, quiet lines, and Eliza Hart stood just inside, letting her eyes adjust, letting the stillness settle around her in a way that felt unfamiliar yet steady. The air carried a faint scent of dry wood and something older, something lived in, not abandoned, not temporary, but kept, and that difference mattered. She moved a few steps further in, her fingers brushing lightly along the edge of the table as if confirming it was real, solid, not something that would disappear the moment she turned away. Outside, Silas Boone remained where he was, one hand resting lightly against the doorframe, not crossing the threshold yet, not because he could not, but because he understood that this moment belonged to her first. The wind moved softly through the open doorway, lifting a corner of a folded cloth on the table, carrying with it the distant sound of open land, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because words would have felt too heavy, too quick, for something that needed time to settle. Eliza turned slowly, her gaze moving across the small room again, taking in the details she had not noticed at first glance. A cup set near the edge of the table, worn but clean, a shelf along the wall holding a few simple items placed with care, not for display, but for use. A blanket folded neatly over the back of a chair, the kind of order that came from routine rather than expectation, and something in that quiet arrangement eased the last of the tension she had carried without realizing. She let out a slow breath, not forced, not held back, just natural, and when she spoke, her voice was softer now, not from weakness, but from the absence of strain. "You keep things simple," she said, her words carrying a hint of observation rather than judgment. Silas gave a small nod from the doorway. His gaze steady. "Simple is easier to hold on to," he replied, and the answer settled easily in the room. Eliza nodded slightly, understanding more than the words alone. She stepped closer to the window then, looking out across the land that stretched beyond the house. The same path they had just walked now visible from a different angle, smaller, quieter, like something that had already become part of the past, and beyond it, the open horizon, wide and unbroken. She rested her hand lightly against the frame, feeling the warmth of the wood beneath her palm, grounding herself in the present. Silas shifted his weight slightly, the boards of the porch creaking softly under his boots, and after a moment he stepped inside, not abruptly, not claiming space, just entering as naturally as he had stood outside, his presence filling the room without crowding it. "There is water in the basin," he said, nodding toward a small stand near the back, "and food. Not much, but enough for now." He did not list it, did not explain, just offered the information as it was. Eliza glanced in that direction, then back at him, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them again, a quiet acknowledgement that this place was not being given to her, not in ownership, but in trust. She gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said, and this time the words carried more weight, not just for what had been done, but for what had not been demanded in return. Silas inclined his head slightly, accepting the gratitude without expanding on it, because he understood that gratitude did not need to be stretched into something else. The light shifted again as a cloud passed briefly over the sun, dimming the room for a moment before returning, and in that small change, Eliza felt something settle fully into place. Not certainty, not yet, but the beginning of it, the kind that grows quietly, without needing to be forced. She moved toward the basin then, her steps steady, deliberate, and as she reached for the water, the simple act felt different from anything she had done before, not because of the motion, but because of the choice behind it. And in that choice, small as it seemed, there was something new taking root, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. The water in the basin rippled softly as Eliza Hart dipped her hands into it, the surface breaking in gentle circles that faded just as quietly as they formed. And for a moment she simply watched it, the way it moved, the way it settled, like something inside her was learning to do the same. The coolness against her skin felt real, immediate, not something distant or uncertain, and she let it stay there a second longer than needed. Grounding herself in the simple act, behind her Silas Boone moved lightly through the room, not crossing into her space, just tending to small things that did not demand attention, adjusting a chair, setting a cup closer to the table's edge, the kind of movements that filled silence without breaking it. The light shifted again through the window, softer now as the sun began to lower, casting longer shadows that stretched across the floor and touched the edges of everything in the room. Eliza lifted her hands from the water and reached for the cloth. Nearby, drying them slowly, deliberately, as if each motion carried its own meaning, she glanced toward the door then, still open, the wide land beyond it visible in the fading light. And for a brief moment she considered it, not with fear, not with urgency, but with a quiet awareness that she could step back out if she chose, that nothing here held her in place except her own decision to remain, and that thought did not press against her. It settled gently, like something she could carry. Without strain, Silas noticed the glance but did not comment, his gaze moving briefly to the doorway before returning to what he was doing, because he understood that some choices needed space to exist before they could be spoken. Eliza set the cloth down and moved toward the small table, her fingers tracing lightly along its edge again, not searching, just feeling. And then she sat, the chair creaking softly under her weight, the sound steady, familiar, like it had been waiting for someone to use it again. She rested her hands in her lap, looking down at them for a moment, then up toward Silas, who had stopped near the far wall, giving her that same quiet distance he had kept since the beginning. "I have not sat without being told to in a long time," she said, her voice calm, not heavy, just honest. Silas inclined his head slightly, not surprised, not questioning. "Then it is a good place to start," he replied, and the words carried no instruction, no expectation, just acknowledgement. Eliza nodded, a small movement, but steady, and something in her posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be felt, her shoulders easing just a fraction, her breathing settling into a rhythm that matched the quiet around her. Outside, the wind moved across the land again, softer now, carrying the faint scent of evening, and somewhere in the distance a bird called once before falling silent. The world continuing in its quiet way, unaffected and yet somehow connected to the small changes inside that room. Silas moved toward the door then, pausing near it as the light dimmed further, his hand resting briefly against the frame. "I will be outside for a while," he said, his tone even, leaving the space to her without making it a question. Eliza looked at him, meeting his gaze fully now, and for a moment there was something clear there, something unspoken but understood. She nodded once more. "All right," she said, and that was enough. Silas stepped out onto the porch, the boards sounding softly under his boots as he moved away from the doorway, leaving it open behind him. And Eliza remained where she sat, the room quiet, the light fading slowly, and for the first time in a long while, the silence around her did not feel like something she had to endure. It felt like something she had chosen, something that belonged to her as much as the breath she drew in the ground beneath her feet. And in that quiet, something within her settled fully into place, not complete, not finished, but begun in a way that could not be taken from her again. The sun dipped lower beyond the horizon, its last light stretching across the land in long fading lines, and the house stood quiet beneath it, steady against the open sky, as if it had always known this moment would come. Inside, Eliza's heart remained seated for a while longer, not because she needed to, but because she could, and that simple difference carried more weight than anything she had left behind. The room around her held no demands, no expectations, just the quiet presence of things that existed without asking anything in return. And slowly, she rose, not hurried, not uncertain, her movement natural, like something that belonged to her again. She walked to the doorway, pausing just inside where the fading light met the shadow of the room. And for a moment she stood there, looking out, across the land that now stretched before her, not as a place to cross, but as a place to remain. Silas Boone sat on the edge of the porch, his hat resting beside him, his gaze turned toward the distance where the sky met the earth. He did not turn when she stepped into the light, not immediately, because he had already felt her presence shift, had already understood that this moment did not need to be met with words. The wind moved softly between them, carrying the quiet sounds of evening, a distant rustle, the faint call of something unseen. And Eliza stepped forward onto the porch, the boards creaking lightly beneath her boots, the sound familiar now, steady, She rested her hand briefly against the post beside her, grounding herself in the space. And then she spoke, her voice calm, clear, carrying the kind of certainty that did not need to be raised. "I will stay," she said, not as a request, not as a question, but as a choice. And that was the difference that mattered most. Silas turned his head then, just enough to meet her gaze. And for a moment there was something unspoken between them, something that did not need to be defined or promised. He gave a small nod, not in approval, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because the decision was hers and hers alone, and that was how it would remain. The last of the sunlight slipped below the horizon, leaving the sky in soft shades of dusk, and the first hint of coolness touched the air Eliza stepped fully onto the porch then, moving to stand beside him, not behind, not apart, just beside, and together they looked out over the land, not as something to claim, not as something to conquer, but as something to live within. The town of Dry Hollow lay far behind them now, its noise and silence both distant, and whatever it had been no longer held the same shape, because something there had shifted, something quiet and lasting, not in the law, not in the paper, but in the people who had seen a different way and could not unsee it. And here, in the quiet space between a small house and an open horizon, Eliza stood not as something delivered, not as something owned, but as herself. And that was where the story changed. Not with a gun, not with force, but with a choice made in silence, the kind that echoes longer than any noise, and long after the light had faded and the stars began to appear one by one across the sky. The land held that quiet truth without needing to speak it, because out here, it was never the loudest voice that carried the furthest. It was the one that knew when to stand and when to stay.